The woman collapsed into the back seat at midnight, tears streaming down her bruised face as she told the taxi driver her story. Her husband had beaten her again, threatened to take the children away, and she had nowhere left to turn. Margaret adjusted the rearview mirror and spoke quietly. "Come with me. We're going to finish this." The passenger had no idea who this elderly taxi driver really was. Welcome to Inspiring Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of hidden strength and unexpected justice, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. If you believe that real heroes work the night shift and drive the forgotten roads, hit that subscribe button and help us share these remarkable tales. But let's rewind to understand how a 70-year-old taxi driver became the most feared force for justice on the city's darkest streets. Because Margaret Thorne's story began long before she ever sat behind a steering wheel. 3 months earlier, Margaret had been living a quiet retirement in her small apartment, watching the news and growing increasingly frustrated with what she saw. Stories of domestic violence cases dismissed on technicalities. Wealthy criminals walking free while their victims suffered in silence. A justice system she had served faithfully for 30 years that seemed to have forgotten its purpose. Margaret Thorne had been more than just any judge. For 3 decades, she had presided over family court, handling the most heartbreaking cases the legal system had to offer. Child custody battles, domestic violence prosecutions, cases where the law's limitations often left victims vulnerable to continued abuse. She had watched helplessly as legal loopholes allowed dangerous people to walk free. She had seen bureaucratic delays put children back into harmful homes. She had witnessed the gap between what justice demanded and what the system could deliver. When Margaret retired at 70, she thought her days of fighting for the powerless were over. But retirement had only given her a clearer view of how much work remained undone. How many people fell through the cracks of a system that moved too slowly for those who needed protection immediately? That's when Margaret made a decision that would have shocked her former colleagues. She obtained a taxi license, bought a used sedan, and began working the night shift in the city's most troubled neighborhoods. But Margaret wasn't just driving for income. She was hunting for the cases that traditional justice couldn't reach. The situations where victims needed immediate help, not months of legal proceedings. The moments when someone with knowledge, connections, and absolutely nothing left to lose could make a real difference. Her taxi became her courtroom. Her passengers became her cases. And Margaret Thorne transformed from a retired judge into something far more dangerous to those who preyed on the innocent. A woman with 30 years of legal expertise and no institutional restrictions holding her back. The woman who collapsed into Margaret's taxi that night was named Sarah Collins. 28 years old, mother of 2, married to a man whose violence had escalated beyond anything she could handle alone. As Sarah sobbed in the back seat, she told Margaret about the bruises hidden under makeup, the threats whispered when the children were sleeping, the police reports that led nowhere, because her husband knew how to charm his way out of consequences. Margaret listened with the practiced attention of someone who had heard similar stories hundreds of times. But unlike her days on the bench, tonight she wasn't constrained by evidence rules, procedural requirements, or the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Tonight, Margaret could act. She drove Sarah not to a shelter or police station, but to a small law office that stayed open late for emergency cases. Inside, Margaret introduced Sarah to attorney Linda Martinez, a former prosecutor who specialized in cases the system typically failed to resolve effectively. But Margaret's assistance didn't end with legal referrals. Over the next 48 hours, she demonstrated why some problems required solutions that existed outside traditional channels. Margaret's first stop was the office building where Sarah's husband worked as a financial advisor. She didn't speak to him directly. Instead, she had a conversation with his supervisor about some concerning financial irregularities that might warrant investigation. Margaret had learned during her years as a judge that abusive men often cut corners in other areas of their lives. A little research into public records, combined with her knowledge of where to look for financial misconduct, had revealed information that could make Sarah's husband very cooperative in divorce proceedings. Her second stop was more direct. Margaret visited the apartment building where Sarah's husband lived alone since Sarah had finally left. She didn't threaten him or break any laws. She simply introduced herself by her full name and judicial title, mentioned that she was now driving taxi to stay connected with the community, and expressed her personal interest in ensuring that families in her neighborhood felt safe. The conversation lasted exactly 5 minutes. Margaret never raised her voice, never made threats, never said anything that could be construed as intimidation. She simply made it clear that Sarah Collins and her children were now under the protection of someone who understood exactly how the legal system worked and how to use it effectively. 2 days later, Sarah's husband signed divorce papers that gave her custody of the children, possession of their home, and a financial settlement that would support her family for years. He also agreed to a restraining order and anger management counseling. When Sarah asked Margaret how she had accomplished in 48 hours what lawyers had been unable to achieve in months, Margaret's answer was simple. Sometimes justice needs to work faster than the law allows. But Sarah's case was just the beginning. Word spreads quickly in neighborhoods where people have learned not to trust official help. Soon, Margaret's taxi was receiving requests for rides that weren't really about transportation. A teenage girl whose stepfather was inappropriate asked for a ride to school every morning, but what she really needed was someone to witness her situation and connect her with proper authorities. An elderly man, whose landlord was illegally evicting disabled tenants, needed someone who understood housing law and could make strategic phone calls to regulatory agencies. A single mother whose ex-boyfriend was stalking her needed immediate protection, while legal restraining orders made their way through the court system. Margaret handled each case with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 30 years navigating complex legal situations. But now, freed from judicial constraints, she could pursue solutions that were effective rather than just procedural. Her methods weren't always conventional, but they were always legal. Margaret understood the system's weaknesses because she had worked within them for decades. She knew which agencies moved quickly and which required pressure. She understood how to document situations for maximum legal impact. Most importantly, she knew how to make people understand that their actions had consequences, even when those consequences came from outside traditional channels. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. Social workers began referring clients to Margaret's unofficial network. Police officers who were frustrated with legal limitations started suggesting that victims contact the taxi driver who helps people. Even some of Margaret's former judicial colleagues quietly sent cases her way when official channels proved inadequate. Margaret's taxi became a symbol of hope for people who had learned not to expect help from traditional sources. But it also became something else, a warning to those who thought they could abuse others without consequences. Because Margaret Thorne had learned something during her 30 years as a judge that most people never discover. Justice isn't just about courts and laws and procedures. Real justice is about ensuring that people who harm others face consequences for their actions, regardless of their wealth, connections, or ability to manipulate official systems. 6 months after Margaret began driving taxi, the neighborhood crime statistics told a remarkable story. Domestic violence reports had decreased significantly, not because cases weren't happening, but because abusers were learning that consequences came swiftly and definitively. Word had spread through the community's networks about the taxi driver who somehow knew exactly how to make problems disappear. Not through violence or illegal methods, but through an understanding of how power actually worked, and a willingness to use that knowledge on behalf of people who had no other advocate. Margaret's former colleagues sometimes asked what she was doing with her retirement. She would smile and tell them she was staying busy, helping people get where they needed to go. What she didn't mention was that the most important journeys weren't geographical. They were the journey from victim to survivor, from helplessness to empowerment, from a system that failed them to a solution that actually worked. Margaret Thorne had discovered that true justice sometimes required driving the back roads that official systems couldn't navigate. Her taxi had become a mobile courthouse where verdicts were measured not in legal precedents, but in lives protected and families kept safe. The woman who had spent 3 decades working within the system had found a way to serve justice from outside it. And every night, as she drove through the city's darkest neighborhoods, Margaret carried with her the knowledge that some battles were too important to leave to institutional bureaucracy. Real change, she had learned, sometimes required someone willing to work the night shift, take the calls that others wouldn't answer, and deliver justice to the doorsteps of people who had been forgotten by everyone else. Every passenger who entered Margaret's taxi was stepping into something more powerful than transportation. They were accessing 30 years of legal expertise, a network of professionals committed to helping rather than hindering, and the protection of someone who understood that the most important cases were often the ones that never made it to official courtrooms. Margaret Thorne had retired from the bench, but she had never stopped serving justice. She had simply found a more direct route to the people who needed it most. Now I ask you, have you ever felt failed by systems that were supposed to protect you? Have you ever wished someone with real power would step in when official channels proved inadequate? Share your story in the comments, because at Inspiring Stories, we believe that true heroes are often the ones working outside traditional systems, finding ways to help when official channels fail. If this story inspired you to believe in justice that works faster than bureaucracy, hit that like button to help us reach others who need to know that help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell for more stories about people who refused to accept that the system was the only way to solve problems. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of courage, creativity, and the magic that happens when someone with skills decides to use them for good rather than personal gain. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful courtroom is the one that comes to you, driven by someone who understands that justice delayed is often justice denied.